Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name again is Patrick Spiro. Thank you all for joining us. We're here for what we've called a wrap-up conversation, and I have a long biographical information on our two guests, but I think most of you are here to hear them speak, not hear me talk about all that they've accomplished. So herewith, I give you Annette Gordon-Reed and Peter Onuf, two of the leading scholars in the early Republic. And they both have been keeping copious notes throughout this session that they showed me. And we were having a brief powwow before this. And I almost just want to ask them, just read me your notes. You know, what do you think? Just let it rip. But I thought I'd just maybe start thinking about the various themes of each one of these panels. And the first one, which kind of is a follow-up from where we ended the conversation in the last panels, is thinking about these documentary projects as projects that have influenced you all, has shaped the field. And I don't know if you just want to share with us how you think these projects, how they've affected you, what they've meant to you, but also how they've changed what we know about the past.
Well, first I'd like to say how happy I am to be here to honor Barbara and Perry. A team here, that's part of the team. I think the documentary projects, certainly I have used the papers of Thomas Jefferson. One of the things that came through today, the continuing thread, is that the documents may have started out as a way to make a monument of the men, and they were men that they were writing about, but they've turned into something different as people have asked different questions about the material. I couldn't have written the Hemingses of Monticello, certainly, without the papers of Thomas Jefferson and without the farm book, which they're going to be working on later on, because he talks about enslaved people in it. We get glimpses of their lives in that particular story. And it's just that people were not as interested, scholars before were not as interested in writing about them, about enslaved people as people at Monticello. So all of this stuff was always there. Nothing that I wrote and nothing that I did couldn't have been written by other people. It's just that there was not the interest in it because we asked different questions of the material. So it's been an integral part of what it is that I've done with the material.
Well, when I started in the business, I actually used the volumes of these paper projects as they came out because I was one of the two people in the country who actually cared about the founders at that point. I'm exaggerating a little bit, and I can't use the word founders anymore without getting into trouble. But that point that Joyce was making about monumentalizing and that Annette just referred to is very accurate for the first 30 or 40 years of publication. I remember a program at the Shear meeting in Madison, Wisconsin, in which the whole point of the panel was to discuss why nobody was using the documentary editions. This is the pre-internet period. And it was very flattering for me because I was mentioned several times as, well, there's always Peter Onuf. And at that point, you could say if you actually looked at those volumes, they didn't make for easy reading. They demanded to be treated as objects. And they were quite beautifully produced, and they still are. And they're nice to have around, they look good. And you could say that it would be a patriotic responsibility for every college, even every high school and town library, to have these as a site of genuflection to our national beginnings. Well, I think the seeds were planted in those letterpress editions for what blossomed in the age of the internet. And precisely because of that obsession with comprehensiveness and with taking the intake of letters, not just the letters written by the great men, was really critical. So what might have at first seemed like an aura around the great men, and this was a monument, it was that aura which became most interesting. I think Annette's wonderful book about the Hemingses is a good example. It couldn't be written without the Jefferson papers, but they were being used instrumentally to locate her subjects. And in a way, that's, I think, a metaphor for how the documentary editions have played out in their subsequent usage, enabled by digitization, is that they provide a map or a framework and a focus that enables new generations of scholarship. I love that comment about would the Jefferson papers ever complete publication, and I hope they don't, because we really like Jeff, and some of my best friends are documentary editors. May they survive forever, because I really think they have generated wonderful scholarship. And the monuments have dissolved before our eyes because we know so much. And there's been a return to political history, a return to an interest in the founding, spurred by the Society for the Historians of the Early American Republic. You might even say a political turn or a geopolitical turn to the vast founding, not the narrow founding, not the guys, but the world. And those worlds are anticipated, in the best work on these documentary editions has given us a roadmap to those worlds.
Yeah, and it's opened up scholarship in ways that people would never have anticipated. And you think that it's a story just about the great men, but it's about all these other people. I was just talking to Jeff Looney about my favorite piece of this, thinking about a piece that he did about, and talking about the family letters, about Jefferson's granddaughters describing Jefferson's discomfort and angst when Burl Colbert, his manservant, enslaved manservant, gets sick. And they have these series of letters where they're talking about him as frantic, essentially, and not a word that you associate with Jefferson as frantic is not what you think of. And then when he reports on this, because they're at Poplar Forest, and he writes back to his daughter Martha, Burl has been ill. We've come near losing Burl, but he's perfectly fine. Well, if you're reading about Jefferson and you're trying to think about of his connection to Burl Colbert or connection to anybody, and you just look at his letter, you see that very terse description. And yet we have several letters from his granddaughters who are describing this person, and they're basically saying, I don't know what's going to happen if we wake up and Burl is dead. What's going to happen to him? And those kinds of letters, things that people didn't think of, family stuff wasn't important, are critical to talking about this person's, to explicating this person for readers to see what he really actually was like.
I'd like just to pick up on that reboot of the documentary projects that we heard, that wonderful testimony from Ellen and Joyce, the counterpoint of how Barbara's volumes could be used and what was there. And it was with a new understanding that she brought in of how we might think of the history of science, not in the classic internalist mode, but to really do it in a historically responsible way. You have to bring that knowledge to the editing to be a good editor, and that's what Barbara did. And as Joyce brilliantly described what could be deduced from those volumes and attributed them to the team, Team Barbara, then that evoked, then led to Ellen's commentary about what it was like to have a gale of fresh air come into the musty offices of the Franklin papers. That would be Barbara, and proper punctuation, and a transformation in a way that was, I think you could all mash that together into a pivotal moment when the monuments crumbled and something better grew in their place. And that was made possible by digitization. Of course, Barbara's not personally responsible for the entire history of digitization. But that's where great women and great men are just right there at the right time and right place, and hooray for her and hooray for us. But I think it did lead to a wonderful moment. And I'd like to think, picking up on what Jeff said about the golden age and that my pessimistic friend Alan dismissed, is what a wonderful way to think about where we are, because I think in many ways it is certainly the worst of times. We know that. It's terrible. But it's also the best of times for doing what we do. It's never been better. And people have been migrating in toward the founding of the Republic for any number of reasons. when I started doing political history, I was so retro, I was so out of it. The social historians had turned so far away from that kind of stuff, and that was great, because then I had it to myself. But they're all coming back en masse, and they're able to do it in new and fresh ways with their knowledge that they've cultivated in their own fields, bringing them to the founding. And I think it makes it incredibly rich. And so that we're now prepared to make use of these editions. And it's a good thing that they took their stately time to come before us, because it wasn't a bang, they're gone. We were so excited when they were easily available, and they have been used, as Jeff told us.
Well, it's amazing to think of the democratization of knowledge, that it isn't just scholars who can use this now. They can go online and read these letters, and people form their own opinions about things. People, when they address me or talk to me about these things, they know a lot, and they've known it because they have been reading these things. And this isn't something that they would have had available if they had just had one volumes, the letterpress volumes, which I have a copy of, as a matter of fact, and I do use sometimes. But making them accessible to everybody makes this era accessible to all, not just scholars, but to everyone. And as I was listening to today, I was thinking about the idea of Barbara as being a part of this transformation, evidence of the transformation, a woman in positions that were typically by males, but also evidence of the change, and also a maker of the change, and doing all these kinds of things. The questions that would be asked would be different. The sensibility about all of these things would be different as well. And it's just a sort of a testament to this idea to be in a place where the change is taking place and you are making the change yourself.
So I thought I might not have to ask another question, just let you guys go. That was my plan. No, this is great. I guess just hearing you all talk, I just want to play the curmudgeonly contrarian, maybe, in the best of time, worst of times scenario that Peter was just talking about.
Kind of times?
Yeah, well, and digitization has been transformative for access. Here at the APS, we digitize en masse. We get 10,000 visitors online to our digital library. We get maybe 3,000 in the course of a year, 10,000 a month. So that's 120,000 a year. So absolutely transformative. But then I wonder about what has changed in terms of the way people do research, in terms of the way they ask questions. And certainly there's been a lot of positive, but maybe there's been some things lost. I know that when I started doing deep archival research, you couldn't take photographs in archives, and so you had to transcribe materials. And that act of transcription for me was extraordinarily helpful, because I had to decide what was I going to invest in, and by making those choices, I was actually going through and figuring out what I really wanted to talk about, where now I see scholars coming into the reading room and leaving with 10,000 pictures only to go home and be totally overwhelmed with all that they've done. So I just wonder if you could also reflect on maybe what has been lost. Keyword searching, wonderful way to find things, but you're also limiting what you may look at because it's only whatever the search term comes up.
There's so many things that I found serendipitously. Things in looking at papers, looking at card catalogs, looking at things like things that were written down, little notes that people had that were not put in, when they made copies of things. There is a loss, definitely. It's always something. You're leaving something behind when you get a convenience. But you have to do a different kind of investigation when you have these these tools available. I remember going down to look at all of the papers at the Library of Virginia, the Virginia Gazette and all those things, and the microfilm just churning and churning and churning. And then when I wrote my first book, I did that. And then by the time I get to the Hemmingses, it's all online, and I could just do those kinds of searches. So there's always going to be a loss or gain anytime there's an advance.
Yeah, well, I'm going to say net gain, all right, because I sensed that was, you didn't really mean that, but that you're challenging. And that is, when I started in this business, and my editorial friends will, I think, agree with me, editors were not at the top of the status hierarchy. They may have been above librarians and archivists. Of course, this was the era of master narratives and master historians. And I think we're looking into the future of a different sociology. I agree, Patrick, with the idea that we sacrifice intensive reading for this super extensive surfing. I think it's the technical word. It's a post-literate regime. But I think what it does is to suggest that there's going to be a new sociology with, yes, I have Bluetooth in my hearing aids, so things happen that I hear, and I'm so happy you're not hearing them. But what I was going to say is I think the golden age will be the age of the documentary editor. But documentary editors have to be good historians. They are. I remember I spent most of my career telling Dick Ryerson he needed to write a book. And he finally wrote a wonderful book about Adams. In the first place, because you people really know this stuff. But I think the future I see, and it's in response to the idea of surfing and cherry picking and all the ways. I really hated it when I first got papers by graduate students that were so many sources, and where did you get those? It seemed just too easy. You just hate it when people could.
That's because you're from New England.
Yes, but what I see
now must be hard.
There will be a need, and there is a need, a desperate need right now for curatorial work, for the historian editor to come first to help us get into the good stuff. I was really impressed in the documentary session. I didn't understand much of it, but it had to do with something about shopping and laundry lists and this, that, and the other thing, and that making these things accessible is just mind-blowing. And what you could do with this, I can't even begin to think of it. I do the laundry, and I enjoy it, actually. There was some dismissive comment about laundry before. And I'm all for it. But
I'm for laundry too. I like clean clothes, you know.
All right, dude, got it. Yeah. So what I want to say is, we need new kinds of literacy, and I think editors on the front lines of creating, giving us access to this stuff. That's what's important. We historians, we're so proud, we're so full of ourselves, and then we get revised, and we're dead. Good editing, good database building, all that stuff that editors set the stage for this, and that's going to be the new generation of editing. That's what's going to matter, and they don't do it as if, yes, we'll give you the whole world. They have to have angles, they have to have frames, they have to have imminent interpretations or ways of looking at the world. That's what the founders, I think, have done, is to give a specific focus on a world we want to recover. Now, there are other focuses or foci, but they're convenient, and it's easy to get them in, and then move out from them. So I think the editor, curator, historian is the future, and I think that's one of the things we should celebrate when we celebrate Barbara Oberg.
You're here.
So there.
So I promised Annette and Peter that I just lob them softballs. So I have one for Annette.
Okay.
Hypothetical situation. I invite you over for Thanksgiving dinner with my parents, and my father asks you, Annette, can you tell me about Thomas Jefferson's life at home, his relationship with women and family? Because that was one of the key themes of our day today, and I wonder how you'd answer that.
Well,
First of all, you're going to accept this invitation. She's not coming.
I'm not coming. I'm not going to go. I would talk about his wife, Martha. One of the most amazing things that happened to me, and I want to say it was Roy Ritchie, but it could have been someone else who was trying to think of the name of Sally Hemings, and she's that woman. No, it wasn't Roy, and she said that woman who was the mother of Jefferson's children. And I thought, no, wait a minute, he had a wife. He did have a wife, Martha. I would talk to him about Martha Skelton Jefferson, who came to Jefferson, brought to Monticello a very unusual family, namely her enslaved half-siblings, and her connection to them that gave him a way of dealing with this particular family of people. I think he took his cue as to how to deal with them from how she dealt with them. And so I would talk about his life with Martha and their children, and then I would say there was another woman with whom he had children, an enslaved woman who was Martha's sister. And then after the jaw drops at that point, because people are always trying to figure out what the hell that's about.
With the food.
What that's going on. And I would talk about both of them, but I would start with Martha and talk about his relations with women. And that's trying to describe his personality through his connection to these particular people. Yeah.
And we are nearing the 250th anniversary, and Jefferson is the father of the Declaration of Independence. And if either of you were asked, and you probably will be asked, to talk about Jefferson in this moment, what are some of the things you're going to talk about?
Well, what I would emphasize, Patrick, is we need to take a document like the Declaration and put it in motion to see how it's situated and what's happening at the moment. And a key word that I would invoke is, let's forget the first couple of paragraphs of those wonderful ideas that warmed over social contract stuff, and let's talk about action. Let's talk about political mobilization, military mobilization, mobilization within families and neighborhoods and communities. As Pauline Maier said many, many years ago, there are many, many declarations. Jefferson was just, in his own falsely immodest terminology, he was just channeling the sentiment of the day. He was Shirley MacLaine before her time. And so he got it. And in some ways, he's right, despite himself. He is a megalomaniac, no question about it. But he was in the middle of a war. We tend to forget that. And wars, as we heard this morning, involve everybody. Everybody's world is, if it were only upside down, then you'd know what you were looking at. But how about sideways and in constant motion? You're getting dizzy from it. And this, it's a curious irony that the things that we focus on in beginning our national story are these transcendent ideas that presumably are the lodestar or the constellation. Those are the norms and values that have guided us across the centuries. No, it happens at a very specific contingent moment when people are forced to make decisions they don't want to make. And it seems to me that what we heard argued for in our first excellent session was a more holistic, and not in a, say, everybody gets to be involved in some meaningless way, but gets to be involved in what is happening, it's action. And I think, in a way, that's what I'm suggesting about the founders and their papers. We're able to put them into motion as well if we're doing due diligence with the hard work that the editors have done to contextualize. Context is really important. Context gives us a frame for thinking about action.
Well, I would say I agree with all of that. However,
Oh, come on.
I agree with that. However, they're two different things, and this is the law part of it for me. The side is that we are in motion. If we focus, we can do both of those things. Historians focus on the context and what the document meant at the particular time, and they have to do that. But the Declaration doesn't just belong to historians. It belongs to American citizens, and they have a particular vision of what it is supposed to mean for them. And it has been how they have put themselves in motion, not motion that's good to know what happened during the war, and that's important to know, and you have to contextualize that, but you have to think about what the document has meant to people as well. And it has been a document of mobilization, but one of a different kind, not war, but social conflict, social transformation. And so I would emphasize both of those things.
Oh yeah, and mobilization does lead to constitution writing, institution building, for better and worse. Yes, yeah. I think it's renewable energy, and I think that's the message I would take from it.
No. Does the author matter?
We don't really disagree, okay?
No.
It's very threatening to me.
Does the author matter at all?
I think the author matters. I think
I've spent my whole life with that guy. What do you mean does he matter?
Well, neither one of you talked about him.
Well, I really resent that. I resent the idea of the people who are trying to suggest, well, he didn't really write it. Franklin added a word, and this person, everybody in this room has written anything who has a copy editor. they have somebody who comes in and suggests that you change a word, but you don't say that that's not your book because somebody else. I mean, he conceptualized, it could have been written a completely different way. And I sort of object as an author to the idea that if anybody made a suggestion to you, that means that you didn't write the thing that you wrote. Now, it's true, there were lots of declarations and he says these are not my ideas, but he did the form of it. I mean, they sent him off to do this and he did it. So I think doing it in this particular way, because he could have done it in another way.
Oh, I would never disagree with her. I don't challenge that.
They don't challenge that, but I mean, does it matter? You know, who, I guess to us it might matter if he wrote it, but it's just in larger terms, it's really the words that matter. And because they were words and ideas that were circulating among other people, then, you know, I get the idea.
The words are a way into the world, and as Rob
Yeah.
Parkinson showed, the bulk of it is about things that have happened recently
Yeah.
that threaten our liberties
That
in
we're
a
upset
big
about.
way. So it is, of course, in that sense, propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
It's designed to spur action.
And to bring people together.
Yeah.
To say, and then this happened to me here, and then they did this, and then that, and that's why we're getting together
No,
to do
but
this thing.
I agree that the way you finally articulate that document will have a life after
Yeah.
it's written. It is a text, and texts are significant. They will be part of the contexts of the intertextuality, the context of the future. They don't go away, and there's going to be a lot of pathway dependence, and that's for better and that's for worse.
Yeah.
So I was on a panel a few months ago, and they asked me if I thought 2026 should be a celebration, a commemoration, or an observation.
Observation.
I'm sorry. We just watch it
Yes.
go by.
Yeah, or it's almost like a mourning, you know. So when you think about 2026, what would you like to see this nation do, and what would you want Americans to experience and walk away thinking, and what would you like global citizens to think about the United States?
I'll start just briefly because I was very grateful to 1987 because I got a lot of gigs. And Jack Rakove and I talked about this. It was the road to 87. This is how old I am. It was lucrative. And of course, it was largely
I can tell you this time around, the biggest problem is there's no money.
and that's good, Patrick, because now I am nearly dead, and I don't care. I don't need the gigs.
What about the rising generation?
And that's what I'm getting to. I think there's a grand opportunity to reset and reboot and get past the national narrative idea is a little queasy because it's going to be a master narrative becomes what? I think we need to do better history, and I think there is an appetite for it. A better history that gets past the stupid binaries. America, yes. America, no. America, you got it right here. It's it. It's gray. It's a mess. And it's what we have to deal with. It's our history. It's our story. Everything that happened here, and of course, it's a story of civil war. It's a story of all kinds of, it's a story of enslavement and all the things that we now worry about quite properly. Put it all together and get it and reflect on it. I think that's the problem with dueling narrative 1619 versus 1776. Get past that. Let's stop fetishizing that you're either on one side or the other, you're a racist or an anti-racist. Let's talk about our history, and that history is very rich. I mean, we spend our lives doing it, those of us who have spent their misspent lives doing this, because it is so engaging, it is so important, it is vitally important. And this is actually the first moment in my lifetime where I think people are. Sometimes in the culture wars, they're ridiculous, the people are misusing history, they don't understand it, but I love the fact there is such a craving for it, a need for it, because we're lost. We need to find a way forward. So I'm going to be out of here, so it doesn't matter to me personally, but for you young people out there, and I see one or two. Anyway, I do think it's if it doesn't happen now, if we don't make it a civic event, then that's an obituary.
Yeah, and I think it could be all of those things, an observation, a celebration, a commemoration of all of it. I just don't think that I think that young people today, whatever is the intended audience today, is primed for something that's gray, primed for something that's a little bit more complicated. It would be kind of hard to go back to just out and out celebration, because that's not what people do now anyway. It would be seen as corny or whatever. I think as I said, I think we're ready to have a sort of a narrative that takes all of these things into account. That's what people expect to have happen. And, there is something to the idea that we live here. You could say, is it a good thing that we're a country, at a basic level? You could celebrate. There would be people who say, yeah, I'm glad that I live here. I'm glad that this is a country or whatever, with all of its problems. But it's going to be all of those things together. It's going to be good. It's going to be bad.
And we've been so collectively gloomy lately that gray is going to look bright.
I know.
It's all relative. That's got to be sunrise.
And there's got to be something.
Oh man, I'm inspired by that.
You're inspired by gray. That's fantastic.
How you can interpret gray?
Yeah, right. So I have one last question before. I'm sure there's questions from the audience, but we have so far ignored the gentleman in the middle there, Dr. Franklin. And I didn't know if you all wanted you all have spent so much time studying Jefferson.
Well, Jefferson and Franklin are interesting to me, because Franklin dies before the fights of the 1790s really take hold. And so Jefferson continues to, he couldn't be an enemy. He admired Franklin and never had to challenge. And I sort of wonder which way Franklin would have gone in that time. On what side would he have been? And Joyce may have the answer to this, or Barbara or other people. Where would he have come down in that particular fight? But this is someone that Jefferson truly admired, and a man of science and so forth, and he was sincere about that, but that's because he never crossed him. He never had an opportunity to come at cross purposes with him.
Well, I think it would have been equally rewarding to do Franklin. He's an interesting character. I think we're approaching a Creole moment in our interpretation of the American Revolution, in which we look at people who flourished under the old regime, like Franklin. And of course, as we know, Franklin had some embarrassing moments on the way to the revolution. He was very much a mover and shaker in the world of the British Atlantic. And that makes him tremendously interesting, I think. And Jefferson is also an Anglophile. And I think both of these characters, you can put them in opposition to each other, and Patrick, you could bring them together right here at the APS. I think they're rewarding, and I think that would make the larger point. There isn't one of these people who isn't deeply rewarding. People have discovered, looking at the one over there at Washington, that he's not stupid. I mean, this has been a big revelation to people, actually. And I think that's the grand achievement of the paper projects, is that they give us access to a world. And that's the payoff. It's not that you can, oh God, I just love everything about Benjamin Franklin. It's so cool. Or Jefferson. No, that's not the payoff. The payoff is, these are a lot of dots, and they're beginning to connect in some dim way, and we're getting a broader image. And this is the perspective that we are enabled to have because of the work that the projects have done.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I think about with Franklin and the papers, because I've never had an occasion to spend that much time in them, but a moment when he's in France and he's dealing with sort of advising John Jay about an enslaved woman who has run away from his home. And Jay's thinking, what should I do about it? And Franklin suggests that, well, she have her arrested, and that she leave her in jail. And that will teach her a lesson, because what they said is that when she left and she took her clothes, she had stolen something, namely herself and her clothes. And she gets sick while she's in prison and then dies. Wow. And it's just a very, very sort of sobering moment to think, because Franklin is presented very often as this kind of, genial, avuncular figure. And there was sort of a coldness about that didn't, it's not a Jefferson story about a girl, say leave her in prison and teach her a lesson or whatever, and then she ends up dying. And that story it's there in the papers, I think has been written about now, but that isn't something that in the past people would have highlighted. But it's things like that just seems like a throwaway story about somebody who's not significant that would today be taken as a real window into the world of the thoughts of Benjamin Franklin at that particular time.
Yeah, actually, it reminds me of a story here at the APS. We have Benjamin Rush's Travels Through Life, the manuscript version, and in it he recounts personal experiences with many of the founders, and he talks about a dinner time conversation he had with Jefferson in which they talked about Jefferson's religious beliefs. And according to Rush's firsthand account, which he recorded in this manuscript, Jefferson said he believed in the Sabbath because it was good for, and I quote, the poor people and slaves. Now, when that was printed in the 19th century, it was excised, that section, and it's only because you have the manuscript that it's available. And the editors like Barbara Oberg, who are now not excising stuff, but sharing everything so that scholars can make those discoveries, is a testament to the work that Barbara and her teams have done over the years. So with that, I think I'll turn it open to the crowd for any questions you have, or I could just ask Peter and Annette to just keep reading off their notes that we didn't cover.
We haven't started yet.
We haven't even started. Any questions? Yeah.
No, I'm not. I'm ignoring all the questions. It is interesting that Franklin dies just in time not to have to be bothered with the early republic. When I use the online Franklin Papers whatever, and I think the key word that shows the essence of happiness for Franklin's life is you put in Bonaparte and nothing comes up. So I take that point, but I do think that there's a moment where the internationalism of the early republic continues to be under scrutinized.
Absolutely.
And so there's a long list of stuff that could be done and what 2025 will mean, but I really hope that, 2026, sorry. I really hope that there is more consciousness of the vastness of early America continuing after, and in some sense, being even more apparent, because it's a very different world. And going back to my question about various founding people's papers, I wonder, the papers of Simon Bolivar, I'm sure there is an edition somewhere, but who did that? What does it look like, and what does it say in comparison to the papers of the guys above you, for instance?
I remember talking to a South American historian about this question of founders, and one of the things he said is that in South America, they focus on the founders as much as in North America, because you know who they are, and there's a moment. And it's not a moment that was not too far ago, not long ago, that people can fixate on. It's kind of hard. Okay, who started France? Who's the founder of France, the founder, whatever. It's much more removed from it. So I wouldn't be surprised if there was not a Bolivar, that there was some equivalent of that, of people trying to pull together the moment to try to explain the origins of their country.
Well, and then there's Bonaparte himself.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I'm for the vastness, and we both got enlisted to do a piece for Karen. You were still there with the vast early America, weren't you? It's all your responsibility. And I think vast is terrific. I mean, there's a vast number of things you can do with vast. And if you focus on something like, let's get Franklin and Jefferson, put them in motion, and do so without taking the story for granted and being aware of all the contingencies involved, there is no reason why the 13 very special colonies should constitute a union out of all the possible candidates. To know that that's true, and to know, as we've heard earlier today, that the revolution was a civil war, is to know that they're a radically contingent moment. And Joyce is absolutely right. If you want to follow the history of settler colonialism from 17th century beginnings in Anglo-America, North America, to the moment of revolution, it's a moment of an extraordinarily unprecedented high degree of integration of the North American colonies into the British Atlantic economy and culture. So it's not, there's nothing foreordained about anything, and that's the joy of history. And now that we can, if we get these guys off of their pedestals, we put them in motion, then we can see they could have participated or not in many different scenarios that could play out plausibly. And this is a way of reinforcing what Annette said. The accident that Jefferson, and it is an accident in the larger scheme of things, wrote the Declaration, does make a difference because you could say intellectually because he was a student of the Scottish Enlightenment. Sure, that's right. A Virginia planter, a slave owner, those things matter too. And the more we know about Jefferson, the more we can read the Declaration in all of its registers.
Yeah. And I do think that, I agree with you, the idea that certainly historians have taken up the reality that this is an international, that the United States wasn't just by itself. It was situated in a world context, and we have to emphasize that. But I wonder how that's going to be in 2026, because we're at a particular moment now. What if we were a stable democracy? What if all of the things that have happened in the past 6 years had not taken place? We might be in a different way. I think that there's going to be, I suspect there might be a therapeutic, an attempt at a therapeutic moment in the coming years, because we may have, well, it depends on what happens in the next election. I mean, we're at a very perilous moment in the country. It's not like this. And if you had said to people in, 1974 that the United States would be where we are now, the kinds of things that have happened, they'd say, that's not possible. That you'd have somebody who essentially made up a life for himself and ran for Congress and got in. And the Speaker of the House would say, oh, everybody embellishes their resume, so let him stay there. It's just inconceivable. And so we're talking about what's going to happen in 2026 in a moment when we're sort of questioning how we're going to continue at all.
In 1976, Jack Green and Gordon Wood were sent all over East Asia to argue about the American Revolution. It's when USIA was part of soft diplomacy, was to emphasize our capacity to disagree. Would we send out? Who would we send out now, and what would the message be?
What would the message be? I mean, we're just in a very, very weird place to be thinking about this at a moment, because are we gonna? I mean, the sort of move against the notion of a republic, a democratic republic. There are lots of Americans who apparently don't believe in it, and so what do you do?
I've just had a thought. And I haven't really had enough time to think about it to know if I should be asking this question, but here we go. But I wonder if the grayness you were talking about is going to help or possibly even hurt. Because if you're talking about the perilousness, and are people losing faith, and is the Republic going to survive, and the message is it's all gray.
Yeah.
What do you
I mean, there's a moment, our colleague Jane Kaminsky, I'm sure you may know her essay, when she's talking about having taught a class in the early American Republic and having in the class a young man who was a reenactor, a Minuteman reenactor, and was very enthusiastic about it. And then after the class was over, she ran into him in town in Cambridge or someplace. She asked him how the reenactment was going. And he said, oh, I don't do that anymore. And she said, why not? He said, well, because I learned in your class that none of that was real. None of that really made a difference. She was like, whoa, that this not had been her intention to take that away from someone. I mean, she was presenting a notion of grayness, and he took the wrong message from it. So the question is, will in a moment that could be therapeutic, in a moment that could, maybe you would hope, might patch things up a bit. What does it mean if we come at it in a more cynical fashion, in a gray area?
No, we come to gray as an improvement, and that would be that things change. And we see the possibility that they'll change. And it's still gray, but we now interpret it.
Okay. Well, that's a hopeful way of looking
Yeah,
at it,
well,
I guess.
come on.
Okay.
That's our job, isn't it?
To be hopeful.
Yep.
I'll come back.
I'll give it to Karen.
I don't know where it is, so. Oh, it's, okay. Somebody have a hand up. Okay, thank you.
Annette, you said that the Declaration of Independence also belongs to the people. I think it also belongs to the author. And Jefferson chose on his obelisk at Monticello to say that he was the author of the Declaration of Independence, the father of Virginia, statue of religious freedom, and the father of the University of Virginia. As we think about 2026, would it be helpful to have a broader conversation about the context in which Jefferson held the Declaration of Independence, especially when speaking about documents regarding freedom of religion and the importance of education?
Well, yeah, given where we are now. We were just talking about this before, that the Supreme Court now is going to have before it some really serious, important free exercise establishment clause cases. And we thought that this was kind of settled in years past, but now it's not settled. I mean, we have a court that has given a charter school to the Catholic Church, essentially, which would have been, not something that would have happened, or he would have thought. So I think that that's one area where a conversation, not just about the Declaration, but about the separation of church and state, that is one way that, I mean, he's sort of in the cellar right now, but in some ways of thinking about his legacy and the importance of that notion. This is going to, because he saw that this is the beginning of the end. If people can say, I don't have to abide by these laws any law because it sort of offends my religious sensibility, this is all over, essentially. And he saw that was a potential breaking point, and here we are right now. So yeah, having the discussion about those things, about education certainly, the attack on freedom of education, freedom of thought, those are areas where those ideas could be a part of the discussion, as his ideas could be a part of the discussion.
Karen?
Yeah, so thank you so much for this super interesting conversation. Peter, your reflections on laundry, your encomium to Barbara, which I think said something like fresh air and correct punctuation. And I thought, that would be a great T-shirt, actually. And I thought, actually, there's something to that, that kind of sense of something fresh and a fresh perspective, and also a kind of rigor, both things. And it made me think of two of my favorite people to quote when I am grappling with this issue around 2026 and what do we do as scholars and what do we do as citizens, and that is the natural pairing of Annette Gordon-Reed and George W. Bush, which is,
You mean
exactly. You always think of these two Texans together.
Yeah. I actually met him.
Texas, right?
You're Texas pal. But at the opening of the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, and Bush said this great thing about a great nation does not hide its history. And I think of all the things he ever said, that was the most coherent and compelling, but really important. That's right. If you want to be a great nation, you don't hide your history and you don't fudge your history. You're straight about it. You play it straight. But you, Annette, on Twitter once, an age ago, you made this offhand, I think, comment, maybe you've elaborated this somewhere else since, and you said, we just need to have a more mature adult relationship with the founders. And that has really stuck with me because I think that's exactly how I think we want people to approach them, not as either venerating, not as devastating, just be adults about it. These are really complex people. They're really problematic, and they did a whole variety of different things. So I guess this is a long-winded comment, which could go into, it could get much longer. But I wanted to ask you, I guess, what your hopes are as both scholars and citizens, not for 2026, but for 2030. Like, once we're past 2026, when we're into the kind of next moment, you know, what is it you're hoping for? What do people think and know about this founding era that has come out of everything we've tried to do for 2026?
Wow, great question. Well, I would hope, we've never been at a period of normality, right? Mm-hmm. But I would like to get past the kinds of attacks on democracy that we're sort of seeing now, where the person gets elected and then they take away all the power. The governor gets elected and then they take away the power of the governor, you know, the opposing party. Or if you lose an election, it's because it was stolen. I would like to get past conspiracy theories that are crazy. You know, I mean, sometimes people do conspire, but some of this stuff is crazy, right? And I just like American society not to be influenced by craziness.
And can 2026 help to accomplish that?
I don't know. I don't know, because it isn't just the United States. There's sort of a worldwide pull away from the idea of democracy, and it could be because of the failures of capitalism, the failures, you know, to bring people along. People feel alienated. People don't see a future for themselves. I don't know if it can. I mean, but I guess what I was getting at before is that you want to tell enough of a positive story to make people think that it's worth it to struggle for. You don't want people to say, the Minuteman person, you know, to say, it really doesn't matter. I'm going to go into my little neighborhood, my little community, and exist there. I would hope that there would be enough of a message of the importance of having created a republic, move away from monarchy and dictatorship, that there was a reason you didn't want dictators. And people have kind of forgotten that. So I'm hoping that maybe that could revive sort of an anti-dictator mentality, that some of that would be seen as fringe and crazy. Of course, there are always going to be people who like that kind of thing. But now it seems to be more people than I would have imagined actually are comfortable with that idea.
Well, Abraham Lincoln wondered what the young men would do when he gave his Lyceum address. And, well, we know what we need to do as a people. This is a dark moment, and our history's been punctuated by dark moments. The story that used to be inspiring, and I think can be rehabilitated for our day, is a story of democratization. Not inclusion in the way it's now discussed, but democratization in which people claim the rights of citizens and they act within the citizen body. It's not an end, it's the means for sustaining a common project. Rule of law, democracy, I agree completely with Annette. We have all been a bit complacent about it. January 6th was a wake-up moment, certainly. That is, somehow it's a self-correcting mechanism and it's not on us. Well, it is on us. And we don't need to envy the revolutionaries for saving their day according to their lights, and we know what's wrong with them. But can we save our day according to our lights? And is there not a common ground? The pathologies of late democracy and populism are enabled by the gift of freedom of speech and organization and petition and so forth. Let's not destroy the gift in a thoughtless, heedless moment. And what can we right-minded, or I should say left-minded people do about this? I don't know. I think it is a moment for historians, though, and other civically minded people to get it right. I'm with the George Bush thing, but more than looking at it just to say, well, we do that. Well, why? We need to look at it because it is part of our history and it is us. And we need to know that. We need to know how we are responsible for moving forward.
Great. Annette, any last thoughts? I saw you looking at your notes.
No, I agree with that. I mean, we really do have to impress upon people that it's up to us to continue it, and that, it was an experiment that Jefferson and Franklin and those people thought was valuable, and maybe 2026 would be just enough to remind people of what a big deal it was to move to that system of
And
government.
the people who are going to move us forward are documentary editors showing us the way. Thank you, Barbara.
Yeah, thank you. And before we break, I think Kathy has a few words to say.
Hi, is this on? Yeah. Excellent. This is the last that you'll hear from me today, I think. We have spent a wonderful day celebrating Barbara Oberg. We have spent a wonderful day talking about Barbara Oberg, talking to Barbara Oberg, and talking sometimes at Barbara Oberg. We feel that it is now high time that we hear from Barbara Oberg herself. And so I'm turning the mic over to Barbara. Do you want me to hold them?
He's saying to put a chair out and turn it
Okay.
around.
Excellent. There we are.
Okay. I'm trying not to fall down, everybody. That would be a horrible end to the... Thank you for this. And I knew somebody had the mic. It's been fabulous, and I don't want to comment on everybody's, but I have a funny similarity to what Ellen Cohn said about Claude Lopez not being able to get a regular position in the history department. When I went to Yale, I went to the chair of the history department and asked whether I could be part of it, what I could, and he said, I have nothing against that, but what if the janitor comes and wants a position in the history department? Boo. Yeah, that's what it was like back then, but it's not anymore. So today's been a wonderful day, and I can't thank people enough, Adriana and Patrick and Kathy, for putting it together, and for all of you to come here and be with us. It's great. And I had all my notes, and then I kept erasing and scraping and adding new ones. I think one of the good things about today has been different people coming from different institutions and different disciplines. And this is what we want to do. We want to bring people together. People, scientists, historians, political scientists, journalists, and heads of institutions. That's going to be very important because we can learn from you. I'm speaking of the heads of institutions as you, and you can learn from us. So that's what we're going to do moving forward. Now, since the name given to this day-long gathering, A Life in Letters, and it's about me, I want to talk about my life in letters as a rather unorthodox job in history, at least it was at the time. It's an untraditional path, but it's what I wanted to do. And maybe one reason that I got interested, when I was teaching early on and my kids were little, people would ask them, "What does your mother do for a living?" And it was easy. They said, "Oh, she just reads other people's mail, that's all." And in a way, that's what documentary editors do. But it's haunted me. My first job was working on the edition of the papers of an Italian, Philip Mazzei, who came to this country. And he was very smart. He brought growing grapes and making wine to Jefferson so he could start it at Monticello. And a project to edit his papers began at Fairleigh Dickinson University, headed by Sister Margherita Marchione, who was a nun, teacher, writer, and she loved Philip Mazzei, and thought that we really needed an edition of his papers. And she knew that he had written the Declaration of Independence, that it wasn't Jefferson, it was Mazzei. That was easy, and she had so many groups of people who liked to come and hear her say that. Then, at the end of one of those meetings with people who'd come to see the project, she said, and not everybody knows this yet, but I know that he also wrote the Constitution. And Barbara is working on proving it right now. And she looked at me and, oh my God. So, that was my first job in editing. It was a little quirky, but, a job is a job. And after that, I went to the papers of Albert Gallatin, Jefferson's Secretary of the Treasury, and he was from Geneva. So I had to go to Geneva to do research in his papers. That was one of the nice things about it being an editor. You might have to go to London or Paris or Spain or Geneva. I went one day, because the papers were still in his family, to see his descendant, and we chatted. It was very interesting. I told him what I was doing, and he said, okay, I want you to take all those papers home with you. Then nobody cares about them here. And so you will take all the Gallatin documents back to the United States. Well, I said, I really can't do that because it would be illegal and I might be thrown in jail or something like that. But those were the first two projects. People looked at me rather quizzically and said, you don't know how to hold down a job? I got a call from Yale after the Gallatin papers and was asked to come for an interview to come to the Franklin papers, where I was, pursuing useful knowledge, as you're supposed to do. And I loved being at Franklin. And, it was a great place to be. The only drawback was that my husband lived in Princeton, New Jersey, and I lived in New Haven, and that was not much fun. Much as I loved Franklin and working with the people at the Franklin papers, I was given a call one day to ask if I would come down to Princeton to interview for the Jefferson papers. As somebody said, yeah, you're leaving us for that tall redheaded man from Virginia, which I guess I was in a certain way. But it was interesting to work on Jefferson. Of course, how could it not be? But it was interesting to work on Franklin. However, it was nice to live with my husband. I loved being at the Franklin papers, but, we never saw each other and things like that. So I did. I left for the tall, redheaded man from Virginia, and never was sorry after that, because I couldn't hold down a job. That's what people said, and I guess they were right. So anyway, that's just what I'm going to say for today. I don't think anybody would have any questions, but if you saw any, Kathy, then you could tell me, and I will answer them. This has been fabulous. You all, I know so many of you, and you've come up and said nice things, and even, one or two people, which I had to be reminded of where I'd known you, you told me, and I remembered absolutely. So thank you to everybody, and is there a reception now?
Yeah.